Right, good morning Year 10. So, our next stop on our tour through the Vietnam War is understanding how did America, the most powerful military power that the world have ever seen, end up being defeated in the Vietnam War. So, there are a couple of different reasons for their failure, and I'm going to go through each one in turn, and each one corresponds to a section of the pages I'm going to assign you. Firstly, the Americans were perceived by many of the ordinary Vietnamese people to be propping up an incredibly unpopular regime. Diem, aside from being Catholic, which marked him out as being different, also ran an incredibly brutal regime. He didn't care too much for human rights, and he was very, very ruthless when dealing with his enemies. And because the US was seen to be propping him up and helping him out, this caused a lot of resentment on the part of many ordinary Vietnamese people, simply because he was so hated. Secondly, the Viet Cong were an incredibly formidable and ferocious enemy. The Viet Cong had been fighting against foreign invaders since the 1940s against the Japanese. They were able to defeat the Japanese. Then when the French came back to try and reconquer Vietnam, they defeated them. They were running a successful insurgency operation against the South Vietnamese government. And once the Americans came into the war, the Viet Cong took the fight to them. The Viet Cong was relatively small, maybe only 170,000 soldiers. Their equipment was relatively basic. The Americans had the latest in terms of fighter planes, in terms of their tanks and their armour and all those sorts of things that they were using. The Viet Cong tended to use very, very primitive weapons. And as we can see, obviously the one on the right side is obviously a picture, but it outlines the Viet Cong had very, very basic weapons, this AK-47, a couple of rocket launchers, things like that. This photograph taken from the time shows a Viet Cong soldier using a rifle that would have been used during the Second World War. So the Viet Cong weren't particularly well armed. However, they played to their strengths, and their strengths were that they knew the country, they knew where to hide, they knew the lay of the land, they knew the advantages of fighting in particular areas, and secondly, they are fighting for their country, which I will come touch upon later. Now, one of the methods that the Viet Cong used against the Americans was something known as guerrilla warfare. What guerrilla warfare involves is, if the Viet Cong were to fight the Americans in a big open battle, they would get annihilated. The American army had been training to fight against the Russians in large conventional warfare, similar to how they'd fought in the Second World War. However, the Viet Cong understood that if they fought the Americans how the Americans wanted them to fight, they would be wiped out. So what they would do is they would do things like hit and run tactics. They would attack a few American soldiers and then disappear into the jungle. They would have a series of tunnels throughout various areas where they could pop up, kill a couple of American soldiers, and then disappear back down again. They also did ambushes, they laid booby traps throughout the jungle. One particularly brutal one was that you would have a pile of leaves on the floor, and when an American soldier stepped foot on those leaves, he would drop down into a pit and be impaled on spikes. They also did things like having a tripwire that was attached to grenades, so when you brushed past it, the pins would be pulled out and the grenades would explode. And this caused thousands and thousands of casualties for the Americans. Now, it is important to bear in mind that when the Viet Cong did engage the Americans in a conventional firefight, the Americans tended to do very, very well, because that's what they were trained for. The Viet Cong understood that they could not continue losing large amounts of men in battle, so they instead adopted these tactics. But it wasn't just the tactics, they also had other things on their side as well. Secondly, they had civilian support. Lots and lots of the ordinary peasants aided and helped the Viet Cong against the Americans and the South Vietnamese. They didn't like Diem as the leader, and the Viet Cong were seen to be sort of the protectors of them. However, the Viet Cong were incredibly brutal towards ordinary civilians and killed tens of thousands of them during this war. Not to say the Americans didn't do that as well, but the relationship between the peasants and the Viet Cong is something that can't be underplayed. Next, there was the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Now, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was essentially a mud road that stretched all the way from the north of Vietnam down into the south. It went through places like Laos and Cambodia, the bordering countries of Vietnam. And what this mud road enabled the Viet Cong to do was to move their soldiers and move their supplies along it. Now, the Americans attempted to destroy it. The Americans had great success in the Second World War, disrupting the Germans moving their soldiers about by bombing train lines. However, the Ho Chi Minh Trail was essentially just a mud road, and if the Americans did bomb it, you would create a crater in the ground that within a matter of hours would be filled in with men with shovels, and you could continue moving along the path. So that was a very, very sort of primitive but incredibly clever strategy from the Viet Cong to move their people around the country. Finally, there is the commitment to the cause. The Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese were fighting for their country, and that cannot be underestimated. It is estimated that around 1 million northern Vietnamese and communist forces died during this war. The Americans only lost between 50 and 60,000. But because the Vietnamese are fighting for their homeland, they're willing to die and they're willing to fight a lot harder than the Americans, because the Americans are fighting thousands and thousands of miles from home. The Americans, however, made several fatal mistakes. So not only were the Viet Cong incredibly ingenious and clever with how they fought this war, the American strategy was ill thought out. Firstly, there was something known as Operation Rolling Thunder. So during the Vietnam War, more bombs are dropped on Vietnam than were dropped in the entire Second World War. So they attempted to bomb the Viet Cong strongholds throughout the entire country and disrupt the supply routes, which I've already touched upon, which was very, very unsuccessful. What they were able to do, they were able to disrupt things like factories in North Vietnam, but they were never able to inflict the big casualties that they had done in the Second World War against the Germans. The other problem with Operation Rolling Thunder was its lack of precision. They essentially flew over these areas and carpet bombed it into oblivion, and tens of thousands of civilians were killed. So what happened was the civilians began to turn against the Americans. You've bombed my village, so I'm going to support the Viet Cong. And that's what happened time and time and time again. The second problem was on the part of the American Army and the American Marines who were fighting there. They went on something called search and destroy missions, and what these missions involved is you'd have a group of American soldiers who would go into the jungle, come across a village, and then burn it to the ground if they suspected it was being used by the Viet Cong. Now, this proved an absolute disaster for the Americans because it turned thousands and thousands of civilians against them, because they would come in, and even if these villages had not been harbouring the Viet Cong, the Americans suspected they were, so burnt it down. They killed lots of civilians. It was truly horrific, and lots of civilians are killed by ordinary American citizens, by American soldiers, which turns them against them even more. The Americans aren't able to win what we call the hearts and minds of the population of Vietnam, simply because of the way their air bombing campaign is run and their war on the ground is fought. And thirdly, perhaps most controversially, was the use of chemical weapons. Now, Vietnam is obviously a country with dense jungle, and the Americans, firstly, weren't used to fighting in that, and secondly, they weren't particularly well prepared to fight in it. As mentioned before, they were expecting to fight the Russians in Europe. Now, what Agent Orange was, is you would have a plane and you would fly over a stretch of jungle, and you would drop Agent Orange over the area. And what Agent Orange does is it kills all of the plant life around it. The theory being that if we can get rid of a lot of the jungle in Vietnam, the Americans can use their tanks and their jeeps and things in order to make more ground. However, there were lots and lots of problems with this. Agent Orange ended up causing lots and lots of issues with children who were born to mothers who had grown up in that area. There are people who end up horribly disfigured, born with lots and lots of birth defects. And if you want to go online and look at the effects of Agent Orange, you can. But just as a warning, it is not for the faint-hearted. It was incredibly horrific. The Agent Orange would get into the drinking water, and when people would drink the water, they would get poisoned. It was absolutely horrific. And there are people still born in Vietnam today who have the consequences of what Agent Orange was. The second chemical they used was something called napalm, which they used to burn the jungle down. This proved incredibly ineffective. Not only was there tons and tons of jungle that needed burning down, but you ended up destroying entire villages full of people from the air. The Americans were not able to win in Vietnam War due to tactical mistakes on the part of the people making these decisions. The other problem, which leads into what I mentioned about how badly the Viet Cong were willing to fight, was that by the mid-1960s, America is forced to bring in conscription. So lots and lots of ordinary young American men were forced to join either the Army, the Navy, or the Air Force to go away and fight in Vietnam. Now, if you're Vietnamese, you're willing to fight for your country because it is your country, but a lot of young Americans resented the fact that they were being sent thousands of miles around the world to go to war with a country that hadn't attacked them. It was easy to justify the draft in the Second World War because of what had happened at Pearl Harbor and what was going on in Europe. But for many Americans, they didn't understand why they were fighting in Vietnam to begin with. So as a result, you ended up with conscripting a lot of young men who were inexperienced and they weren't professional soldiers, so they lacked the motivation to be there. They lacked the morale because they didn't understand why they were there. They didn't want to be there. And as a result of this, they did not behave in the same professional manner that professional soldiers would have done. So it was a catastrophic succession of errors on the part of the American leadership that ultimately led to their failure in Vietnam. So I will send out what pages you need to read and what questions you need to answer. So thank you very much for your time.